Hey guys, Nick here with, I believe to be the 13th episode of Off the Cuff. I am just coming back from the gym, and so, I'm wearing this beautiful piece, which we will talk about a little later on in the video, and, not in my normal garb, but I figured that this week we would discuss watches through the years because I'm like I said, I'm wearing this piece and it's a beautiful timepiece, and it just got me thinking, basically how we went from something like this, which, if you guys can see, is just a pocket watch, to something like this, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But even though it's very unbecoming on the wrist as far as movement, complications and things of that sort, it's a very interesting piece that behind the case there's a lot going on. So I have four watches here. Everything from this piece right here, which is a Waltham. So it's not a piece that we carry very often. We did have a client who had picked them up for us as a gift in one of the estate sales that he worked with. Super interesting. And then you go all the way from here, which is a vintage Omega Constellation. It is backward, so I am going to, make it right side up. So this is from 1969, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then you have something like this, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is a 16610 with a, the hollow end links. So a little, we'll talk about this. And this, they only recently discontinued within the last couple of years. I think within the last 10, 20 years. But just kind of the whole life cycle of how we started, and kind of where we ended up with these APs, and more stuff that we deal with on a regular basis, which is the modern kind of pieces. But listen, we can go and have a little history lesson, you guys and myself as well, because obviously one of the main awesome things about this channel is that I'm always learning. And we never try to position ourselves as, even though we're dealers out here in New York, shout out to Brooklyn, I think that we do everything we can to learn more about pieces. I'm no vintage expert, but every watch that looks cool is a watch that I like, whether it's from 1940 or 2015, and I think it's a really interesting and awesome to be able to kind of run the gamut with a lot of different watches. So I guess we would start with this one here, and this is actually really interesting. This is, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, a Waltham. And just doing some research on this, and kind of learning about it, you learn that so these were actually introduced in 1847. So this piece is a really interesting piece from 1847. They discontinued production in 1857. So about 10 years. They had they started out as just watches for the railroads. People needed to know what time to catch their drift and their time. So they, their trip rather. So they decided to, pick these up, and you had really popular brands at the time, like this one here. Then you had Elgin. Elgin is one that I personally am a little bit more familiar with before doing some research for this video here. Elgin, then you have Hamilton. We had a couple of those as well. So this gentleman, very nice guy that we work with, basically gave them to us as a gift and just said, hey, listen, I can pick these up in the estate sale, whatever you got for them, more than happy to work with you on it. So these pieces are actually really interesting because a lot of people think of watches, especially nowadays. I mean, tailored timepieces, especially these pocket watches, they think of them as style-only pieces. But I mean, this piece is incredibly interesting. I mean, if you look at the back here, you have the bridges, and the trains. As you can see, it is railroad tested and railroad approved. And it's interesting to kind of talk about that a little bit as well. When they say that it's basically railroad tested and railroad approved, having a little trouble rolling my R's there. It wasn't just, basically a bunch of guys got together and said, I like this watch, and we sponsoring this watch. So basically there were certain expectations for something that would get this stamp of approval, kind of like Kosk now in more recent times. So the whole list of things that they had to check and to test for and be approved for, something like this, it had to have 5 different ways of changing the time. So as you could see here, I'm not really going to go and change this 5 different ways because it does need to be serviced. But over here in the crown, they would adjust the crown. Another thing that it needed to do was have 17 jewels. The modern watches now have a lot more than that, but back in the 1800s, I mean, I think that was pretty solid. Basically, what a jewel is if you ever see the, basically the purple or blue, I mean, for lack of better words, jewels on the movement of a case, especially if you have an open case back, which this is not, and I'm not going to open this up right now because it does need some work. Keeps the parts from grinding and destroying themselves as the mechanisms run. But it had certain standards, and I mean it had to be able to tell time at certain times, had to be able to run a certain way, and I just thought it was really interesting to have a piece like that. I mean, this piece specifically, doing some more research into this piece specifically, it was towards the tail end of that run where they did the railroad watches. I mean, it's just a really unique piece. So this case here is another thing where they didn't have a lot of the refineries that we have now to, do a lot of things with precision. So what they did was they took coins and they melted down silver coins, about 90% silver coins, and made a casing out of this, for this pocket watch. And, interesting thing is, I'm familiar with R-Page as a brand. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them. They're a brand that really started on different forums on Facebook. The guy's name is Robert Page. What he does is he takes those Elgin movements and other things, and he turns this into a modern watch, that you can wear on your wrist. And I just think that's incredible. I mean, just look at this thing right now. It's still moving. It's still running. If you could see this right here. And I just think that's incredible, to have a watch that is over 100 years old, where, the seconds hand is still going pretty strong for its age. Another thing that they really, really needed was you had to have, these larger dials in a neutral color, and they had to be in Roman numerals. And the reason for that is because, you needed to be able to check the time quick if you were, looking for a train or whatever it was, or, if you were a conductor, you had to look at it quick, see what time it was, and then put it away. And I think that, when it comes to railroad tested and railroad approved, just think it's really interesting that we went from something like that to, Kosk. And I mean, it must have been a much more difficult process, but it's funny because you don't hear a lot from this brand these days. I mean, Elgin is still a pretty popular vintage watch company. Hamilton, we just sold a khaki field last week, but Waltham is, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. It's funny that some of these brands, they kind of just fade into obscurity. When it comes to, modern watchmaking, I think that's really interesting, and then you look at something like this. This is an Omega Constellation. This is from the 50s and 60s. So basically what happened here was Omega, to celebrate their 100th anniversary in the in the 1940s, they decided to make an automatic timepiece because they didn't have a lot of them. They'd been in business for 100 years, and they wanted something unique. So they came out with this, and they did a bunch of testing. They did something called observatory testing, which is very similar to Kosk. It took a lot longer to get done, but they basically would run a bunch of tests, and if they approved the testing, you would have the movement rather. So they would test the movement, and if they approve the movement, then you would move on. A lot of constellations do have those kind of Manhattan hands and things like that, and that's kind of become more popular in recent years, where it has like the hard to explain, like the connectors on it, and they basically have that case style. But this here was, it's gold plated, and I just think, like, to go from, even something like this to something like this, it doesn't look night and day. Here, I'll try and put them together. To go from something like this to something like this, it doesn't look night and day, but it really does. So, basically, so in 1952, they did launch the Constellation Collection, and they had guys like Gerald Genta work on it for several years, and this piece specifically is from '69, which I like because, they talk about the moon landing and things like that. I think that's very Omega centric. So, to have this specific piece from '69 is really cool. And it's gold plated. So, they have modern gold these days, which doesn't rust out. However, I feel like for a, so '69, you're talking about, more than 50 years to have a gold plated piece that isn't rusted up like that, is awesome. They've really come a long way, from, making sure that pieces don't get jammed up and they don't rust and wear as you wear them, which is another thing I'll bring up when we talk about this here, this U1. But as you can see, it's characterized over here by the case back over here, and you have the the Constellation Constellation insignia. And again, they're called Omega Constellation because you did have observatory testing, and they wanted to stick to that, that motif. And I just think it's a really unique and interesting piece. The movement is it is a closed case back, but the movement is, automatic. As I was saying, the reason the Constellation came about was because they really wanted to get into more automatic pieces. And on this piece here, you have like this mahogany, brown, red mixed strap. And I think it just fits really well. I mean, something like this, I think that, nowadays, you have a bunch of really modern people saying that watches have not, they have no practical use anymore. And I think I would agree with that to an extent, in the sense that, like, no one's using their nav timer to go and test stuff in the air when they're piloting planes, just because a lot of people aren't piloting planes. No one's I'm not diving the full meters with my deep sea dweller. If I do get it wet, it's in the pool or it's in the shower. But no one's going 1,000 meters down. So I think the utility of watches in general through the years has softened a bit. I mean, there still is a lot of value in the utility and practicality of watches, but I think, especially in the 60s, that was the golden age of watchmaking, and no pun intended here with this gold-plated piece. But I mean, it's incredibly light. It's incredibly thin. You're looking at like 34, 35 millimeters of watch here. And keep in mind, back then, that was big, by watch standards. I mean, most vintage watches are anywhere from 28. A lot of them don't go up, more than, 36, 37. And even then, 37 is big. So, I mean, if you put this thing on the wrist right now, I'll put it on my other wrist and be double wristing it as you will. But if you put this thing on the wrist, it doesn't look, it doesn't look small by any means. I have a 7.5-inch wrist, and, I think it just complements everything very, very well. And then, of course, a couple of years later, so they decided to come out with the subs. And the subs, they did come out in the 80s. I believe 88 was when they first came out with this reference. This is actually the 4th generation of the sub that they had. This is a 16610 with the holes in the casing. So basically, if you see the holes in the casing here, you'll see that basically it is a little bit older. So basically what they did was, they made a Submariner, and, you could tell this is a older iteration of the piece, because, I don't want to say flimsy, but of the bracelet, it's got those hollow links, and then, going on, further, they decided to, towards the tail end of their production, make those solid and more of a hefty bracelet. I actually like that this has some hollow links, because I feel like it's lighter on the wrist. It doesn't feel like you're wearing something super, super crazy. But this Submariner here, I just think it's crazy. I mean, to just think that, this watch here is from, the late 80s, is when they started producing it, and they didn't stop producing until, I would say, about 15, 20 years ago. I know, anyone who knows anything about subs is that in 2005, they started to engrave the rehat, which is the inside casing here. If you ever look at the, the inside of a watch, inside of a face, you'll see, basically a serial number on that. So that's how you know this is a little bit older, because it does not have that engraving on it. But I mean, even just, recent years, to go from this stainless steel right here, the stainless steel bezel to a ceramic bezel in the course of maybe 10, 15 years. It's these minor changes that you can really see. And I mean, all these pieces look incredibly clean for their age too. I mean, if you're looking at a watch like this and you're saying this is a 150, almost 200-year-old watch, it doesn't look like that. And this isn't something that a lot of people take into account, is that, watches, I always try to stay away from the fact that watches are investments, because I think that, especially in this market, while it's a great market, and we'll be talking about that, in future episodes, I think I'm going to have a guest on where I talk about that. It's a cyclical one. I mean, I used to be in real estate as well, and one thing I could say is that black Daytonas are not going for 50 grand anymore. So while I don't think that it's responsible or respectful of me to tell my audience that watches are good investments, I think that they are definitely stores of value. I mean, something like this you can get for a couple $100, which back then was a lot of money. Nowadays, maybe that's half a paycheck for some of you guys, whatever it is, to just enjoy the horological, I'm pronouncing it wrong, another tongue twister, but horological, beauty of a lot of these pieces. I mean, this Submariner, I mean, you got 40 millimeters here, and it doesn't, even though it's got that flimsy bracelet, it doesn't feel flimsy. And one of the things I noticed, looking at all the cost and basically test services that they had, which is something that, I definitely want to touch on, is as watches became more and more mainstream, the process for testing them actually became a lot less involved and a lot less taxing. I mean, you have something like this where they had the railroad system where you had to test it against the speed of a train, and you got to test, stopwatches and things like that. And they have certain, features that they have to cover. They have certain things these watches have to do in order to get railroad approved. And then you go all the way here to, basically observation testing, which, again, lasted anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. And it was definitely a lot more taxing than something like a cost, which, I mean, it can take that long. But I just think it's amazing how the processes have changed and how we've just become so much more concise with basically testing these pieces to get them out to market and to make sure that they're safe for people to use. I know that you guys have been staring at this watch on my wrist for a while if you're still involved with the video. So this is actually a piece that I think is very interesting. This was released in the early 2000s. And this is actually made of a Submariner steel, not Submariner like Rolex, but basically a submarine. They took a U-boat and they took steel off of a U-boat and they tegimented it. So basically they made it almost as hard as ceramic, but a little bit more durable. And they put it on a watch. And I mean, I would never think that, like, wow, they took like a material from underwater craft and now you're wearing that on your watch, and this thing can go, hundreds and almost 1,000, meters in the water, and it doesn't rust. That's actually one of the things that they did, was because Sin, I find that when they do dive watches and when they do aquatic style watches, they go hard. A lot of these watches, you put them in salt water and they start rusting and they start oxidizing, which is a process where it does kind of start rusting out a little bit. And this Sin is interesting because they coated it with a material that basically you can submerge it in salt water and it's still going to look the same. And it doesn't tarnish the same way other watches do. It's got that beautiful dive class to it, so that people with bigger wrists can enjoy it. And it's funny because this is actually a 44 millimeter piece, and I feel as though it doesn't engulf my wrist. And that's something too. I mean, to go from something like this, I mean, there is about 10 millimeters of size on it, and you could tell, don't get me wrong, but I think that through the years, we've definitely developed a more compact system where, a 44 millimeter watch, 10, 20 years ago does not look the same as those 44, 50 millimeter watches that are out now. I mean, granted, they just came out with the Seagull Challenger, which, although I love your opinion, I'm staying away from that. I mean, that beautiful piece, but I think 44 was a sweet spot for that model. I think, now that you're at 50, it's a little big for me. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty big wrist. I think that's more of a gimmick than anything else. But I mean, this piece here, it's basically it's they took, like, I just think of that, like, what, they just took a submarine and they took a U-boat and they put it on a watch. And you have this bezel here that it's got plenty of clicks, and it's very, very durable. And I think the durability and the tools and the materials used in watches these days, I think it's just night and day. And people that tell me that watches are fading out and the market's fading out, everyone's got their phone, I would encourage them to pick up something like this. I mean, granted, I wasn't expecting to give my opinion or my review on something like a Waltham pocket watch. I would encourage them to pick up a more vintage piece and just kind of see how we went from these small, inconcise pieces to pieces that are robust and can tell time within milliseconds. I just think that's crazy. So I don't think watches are going anywhere. I think that if you're a watch collector, I think you'll enjoy them for many, many years. I'm hoping that, I'm in my mid-20s now, and, I hope that, 50, 60 years from now, I can have conversations about this stuff with my grandkids and talk to them about, when I was their age, we had these pieces and they were ceramic, and, I don't know, maybe in 10, 20 years, you'll come up with a submarine that doesn't scratch, and doesn't get those dust dyes, which would make my job a lot easier. But I just think it's amazing. And I think watches, unfortunately, like I said, I wasn't able to open up a lot of these pieces today. Maybe that's something we could do another day when we have a little bit more time in our hands. But this is, I want it to be as off the cuff as possible. Also, some of the materials that I have and tools that I have to open up the piece, Eric actually has in our Austin office, because that's where usually we send stuff as a fulfillment center before we send it down to me. He'll take the photos and do things like that. But I mean, just to see the insides of some of these pieces, I think that we're in for a very unique and interesting ride. So I'm excited to see what the future of watches hold. And, thank you for joining me today. I mean, this was truly off the cuff. I just came back from the gym. But, it's granted, this is something I could wear to the gym because it doesn't scratch and, get all damaged the way that other pieces would. But, to me, that's incredible that we're given this opportunity to work with those pieces every day, and they are little pieces of art and history and engineering, and I'm just that's freaking cool. I mean, I just think it's cool, and so I'm grateful to have you guys, be able to listen to this, and I'm grateful to be working with these kind of pieces every day. Thanks so much, and see you in the next one.